Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to the Urban Legends and Mythology 2024 Halloween special. On this episode, we are diving into everything Halloween. We're going to go through the history up to the modern day and talk about how awesome of a holiday it is. It's that amazing fun holiday at the end of October, where we truly celebrate all things spooky and macabre. We dress up as ghosts and witches and have parties. And we send our kids out going door to door in order to extort candy from strangers. To be honest, here in America, it is the second most fun holiday of the year. But this being this show, we have to naturally ask ourselves, where did all this come from? Where did it start? How did it become affiliated with ghosts and legends and the macabre? And where did the traditions come from? And is a story that we've been told forever that the start point was in Ireland with Samhain, or Samhain, or however it's pronounced, because there's 1,000 different pronunciations, the actual origin point of this holiday. So let's do what we always do and start at the beginning. And for this beginning, we're not actually going to start in Ireland, but we are going to kind of generally stay in Europe. And we're going to go back to that transition point between the late Mesolithic and the early Neolithic. So let's say, rough estimate, it's 7,500 years ago. Because this was a time in Europe and parts of Northern Europe where we were starting to see that transition from hunter-gatherers to farming cultures. And it's during this time when we start to see a fundamental change in humanity. We're going from a lifestyle that was very mobile to a lifestyle that was becoming more and more sedentary. We were starting to see the beginnings of agriculture, the cultivation of cereal grains, the domestication of things like sheep and oxen and goats and cattle. We were starting to see the introduction of more permanent settlements, and we were seeing this rise in things like burial cultures, which in part goes in tandem with some of these earliest religious practices we see coming out of Europe. And we have to remember that humans, for the longest time, lived a very cyclical existence. Our existence kind of flows with the seasons, especially when we become farmers. And that naturally ends up getting tied into our religious practices, especially when it comes to things like observations of the sky, which tell farmers when to plant their crops, when to harvest their crops, etc., etc. And that kind of leads to a religious significance around things like equinoxes and solstices. And as these cultures progressed throughout the Neolithic era, traditions, celebrations, and festivals would grow out of these seasonal cycles, and your harvest festivals would become very significant because a successful harvest would mean that your village or whatever would have an abundance of food in order to make it through that next yearly cycle. And naturally, humans being humans meant that beliefs were going to form around this stuff. And of course, naturally, your harvest festival that usually happens at the end of autumn as you go into the dark, cold, almost death of winter. And when we think about that imagery of winter, what do we get? It's a time where plant life isn't as abundant. The trees have gone dormant and all the leaves are on the ground and buried under piles of snow. It's a cold, dark time where the days have gotten shorter and you huddle into your little homes around the fire for most of the day. And this is where you're telling your stories that become your traditions that hell even will evolve into religious practices. And winter kind of gets this reputation as the dark half of the year or the dead half of the year. And from that imagery right there, we see the earliest incarnation of death as being associated with the end of this harvest time. And in Northern Europe, particularly in Ireland, we start to see the rise of this harvest festival called Samhain. Now, it has many different translations, but for the sake of easiness, I'm just going to call it Samhain. And it arises out of this Celtic-like culture that's ethno-linguistically known as the Gaels. So these people are generally natives to places like Ireland, Scotland, the Isle of Man, a little bit in Britain, kind of that general area. But it's on Ireland where Samhain really kicks off. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, what is Samhain? So it's literally a harvest festival which kicks off the beginning of the dark half of the year. In the modern calendar, it begins at the end of October, so October 31st, and goes through November 1st. And they're essentially celebrating the end of a successful harvest. It's the time of year when the harvest has been brought in, the animals have been brought down out of their pastures, and they're feasting and partying and thanking their deities for a successful harvest. And to be honest, we don't really know how big these festivities got. Some say they were huge. The linguistic kind of history say these were huge gatherings of peoples. It's usually stated that the peoples, if they were warring or whatever, would come together in a general peace in order to party and celebrate this most important festival of the year. However, there was a religious aspect to this too, because this is a liminal time of the year. It was a time when it was thought that the veil between the realm here in life and the realm in death would be at its thinnest. And this was a time when you could communicate with the Fae, also known as fairies, and those in the realm of the dead could cross over. They would usually cross over to visit their homes and their families, and there would be sacrifices offered to appease these spirits, generally small sacrifices in the form of food or drink. And this would be done to ensure that those here in the living realm would be able to survive the winter with their blessings. And we also see this kind of interest in death around this time because we see a lot of these Neolithic passage tombs in Ireland, which are aligned with the sunrise around the time of Samhain and subsequently Imbolc, which goes to show that these beliefs are stretching way back into the Neolithic. And to be honest, we don't really know much about the early history of Samhain. Hell, we don't really know much about the early history of Ireland because none of this stuff was really written down until about the 9th century AD. For an extremely long time, this was all handed down through oral histories, but it's around the time of the 9th, 10th century when Christian monks start writing down some of these old Irish folk tales, and we see the earliest mentions of Samhain as a festival. And it's from this we're able to glean a little bit more information, although it may have been, by this time, somewhat perverted by, Christian propaganda. Let's remember, by the time this stuff comes around, Christianity has been in Ireland for about 500 years, so you have to take some of it with a grain of salt. But where we first see a reference to Samhain in literature is in the 10th century tale Tochmarc Emir, The Wooing of the Emir, in which the writer lists Samhain as the first of the 4 seasonal festivals of the year. It goes on to say that during the festival, a great peace would be declared throughout the land, and there were great gatherings where they held meetings, feasted, drank alcohol, and held contests. Another tale called Cormac's Adventure states that the Feast of Tara was held every 7th Samhain, and hosted by the High King of Ireland, where new laws and duties would be ordained, and anyone who broke the laws established during this time would be banished from, their tribe or village or whatever. In other Irish folklore referring to Samhain, it's stated that this was a time when doorways to the other world opened, allowing supernatural beings and souls of the dead to come into our world, and that Samhain is essentially a festival for the dead. And some of this is mentioned in a narrative known as the Boyhood Deeds of Finn, or it could be Fionn. It's spelled Fionn, so any Irish speakers out there, let me know what the correct pronunciation is. But for the sake of my sanity, I'm just going to say Finn. And I believe these stories were first written down in the 12th century. Now, one of these tales tells the tale of Aline, who is like this evil fire-breathing deity who would lull his victims into a sleep before killing them. So the tale basically goes that each year Aline would emerge from the underworld and burn down the palace of Tara during the Samhain festival, after lulling everyone at the festival to sleep with his music. So one Samhain, a young Finn MacCumh, or Cumhale, I don't know. I've heard it both ways. We'll call him Finn. Finn, he manages to somehow stay awake and not be lulled to sleep by this music. And he engages Aline in battle with this magical spear, and he slays them. And for this, he is made the leader of the Fianna. And I thought Russian names were hard. At this point, I'd probably rather be talking about Russian names right now, because this stuff's hard. But for context, the Fina or the Finn or whatever, they're this Celtic tribe, and now he's the leader of them. In another one of these folk tales, our hero Finn, once again, he's at another one of these Samhain festivals, and this creature called the Clubda comes out and steals a roast pig, and Finn once again kills it with a spear. This happens on a burial mound in Slievenamon, which is this mountain in Tipperary, Ireland. And at the end of that story, like, his thumb somehow gets, like, stuck in the other world, and he pulls it out, and it's, like, in pain, so he puts it in his mouth to ease his pain, and then he's imbued with all this otherworldly wisdom. It's a good story if you can actually pronounce the names of the characters and locations. But my favorite little story comes from Colloquy of the Elders. This was written down probably around 1200 AD, and this essentially is the tale of these 3 female werewolves who emerge from this cave in Cuchulainn. It's another one of these otherworld portals which opens up during Samhain. And these 3 werewolves emerge, and they're going around and they're killing livestock every Samhain. And it's like, that's not cool, don't kill my livestock, I need it to get through the winter. So our 2 heroes in this narrative are a guy named Cas Corach and a warrior named Cailleach Mac Ronan. So Cas was this dude who played the harp, and he played it so well that he was able to lure these werewolves back into their human form because they were just entranced by his music. So while entranced by this music, and after being transferred back into human form, our other hero, Cailleach, throws his, I guess, magic spear at them, and the spear penetrates all 3 wolves and kills them right then and there, essentially saving the day. And there are just a ton of other stories and tales like this that all seem to happen around the time of Samhain. And it's these Irish folk tales that are taking place during Samhain, which makes me think they were most likely told during Samhain. And it seems like it gives rise to that idea of ghost stories around Halloween. And by the time these stories are written, 10th up until the 12th, 13th centuries AD, we can see that this time of Samhain is holding great significance in the culture of Ireland, in this case. Of course, even by this time, it has long since been heavily Christianized, and it was being Christianized as far back as the 5th century AD, when the Catholic Church was really making its first incursions into Ireland. And this really comes out of the Christianization of Europe through the Roman Empire. And while there were never any Roman settlements in Ireland, there was a lot of trade going back and forth, and with trade comes ideas. And a lot of these late Roman, early Christian monks would travel to places like Ireland in order to spread their Christian beliefs. I mean, it's literally where we get the story of St. Patrick from. And it's during this time, the 4th through the 8th century, where we see a lot of Western Christian influence come into the holiday. And it really comes from this tradition that's going on in the early Christian church, where these saints and martyrs for Christianity have their specific feast days. However, as the saints and martyrs pile up, you can't necessarily have a feast day for each one. And on a quick side note, the idea of saints being worshipped and having these feast days in Catholicism is a very interesting phenomena, because it somewhat mimics polytheism, which was basically what everybody else in the world was used to. So it made the spread of Christianity throughout Western Europe a little more palatable for these polytheistic cultures. But back to the topic at hand, you can't necessarily have a feast day set aside for every single saint and martyr. It's just not feasible. So the early church comes up with this idea of All Hallows Day or All Saints Day, and it's that feast day where you celebrate all the saints of Christianity. And it would eventually grow into this kind of 3-day affair consisting of All Hallows Eve or All Saints Eve, All Hallows Day, All Saints Day, and then All Souls Day, where you pray for the souls of the departed. And this idea all comes together in Rome around the middle of the 4th century. And the Romans were holding this holiday in the spring, specifically on May 13th. And this date's very important to the Romans because on this date is the Roman festival of Lemuria, which is their festival celebrating and honoring their dead. Now, I'm not going to dive into the whole history and mythology of Lemuria here. It's basically the Roman festival of the dead. And it was during this festival when the Romans would hold certain rites in order to exorcise ghosts or vengeful spirits from their homes. And even on May 13th, 609, Pope Boniface IV rededicated the Pantheon in Rome to St. Mary and all martyrs during Lemuria, effectively placing a Christian rubber stamp on this pagan holiday. And it's by the 8th century when we start to see this shift from the middle of May into November, because in places like Ireland and Northumbria and even in the Frankish Empire, we start seeing the churches holding these feasts dedicating all the saints on November 1st. So by around the year 800, we see these two holidays merge into one, and All-Hallowtide effectively begins on October 31st. Now, people speculate back and forth which one influenced which, and was Samhain just effectively Christianized, or did the Christians in Rome decide to move this holiday to the end of October in order to coincide with Samhain, in order to allow Christianity to spread even further? And as always, to be honest, the answer is somewhere in the middle. I would say in between the 400s and the 800s, Christianity already had a stronghold in Northern Europe, and it's just going to spread a lot easier if you're coinciding your religion with these other religious practices and feasts and festivals and stuff. But by the 9th century, we can see that the holiday, at least in its Christian form, has really taken a stronghold in Europe. It's loosely associated with the dead and monsters and stuff, but that's about it so far. And it's like, okay, that's all said and done, that's a good foundation, but where are all these traditions coming from? Where did the idea of trick-or-treating come from? The idea of things like Mischief Night and witches and all the stuff we associate with it today. And a lot of that really comes from some traditions we start to see popping up around the 1100s as the holiday is really kind of taken effect and has become a permanent part of the church. So on October 31st, All Hallows Eve, it started to become customary for people to start visiting the graves of their loved ones. And while visiting these graves, they would pray for their loved ones, they would light candles and leave them on these graves, and they would leave flowers. And it's still seen as that old practice of respecting the dead. It also became customary for the town criers. They were the ones that walked around town and made announcements, like political announcements and stuff. It became customary for them to dress all in black that day and walk around town ringing a bell in a somber fashion and reminding all good Christians to remember the souls of those who may have died impoverished or alone and had no one to pray for them in the afterlife. Also, by the time we hit the late medieval period, around the 1400s, a common practice was the baking of soul cakes. Now, these were what we would call here in America a shortbread cookie, and these little cakes were supposed to be representative of a loved one's soul. And basically the whole idea behind that is two-part. For one, it's the end of the harvest season, so you're going to have an abundance of grain, which means you're probably going to have an abundance of flour in order to make these soul cakes. And these soul cakes would be handed out to basically roving vans of poor children who would go house to house in your village or whatever, singing hymns and offering prayers for their deceased loved ones, most of them who would be trapped in purgatory. And although these soul cakes were supposed to be like an offering to the dead, the soulers would act as a representative of the dead and eat the soul cake for them, while singing and doing these prayers for their soul. And that's the popular myth that leads to the idea of trick-or-treating, or at least the one aspect of trick-or-treating, going to a house and collecting a treat. And of course, while souling on these dark nights, they would carry lanterns, and these lanterns were for two purposes. For one, the light was supposed to ward off evil spirits, and for two, simply just because it's dark, you need a lantern. But these lanterns were made from hollowed out turnips, which was a common root crop across the British Isles. I mean, hell, to be honest, it's a common root crop pretty much everywhere. It's not really common here in America. We're not really a turnip eating culture. But that's mostly because we prefer bacon double cheeseburgers, but I digress. And these lanterns also become associated with Halloween because they have their own mythical origin story in Ireland, and it comes from the tale of Stingy Jack. Now, Stingy Jack, he was this guy in like early medieval Ireland. Now, there are several different tellings of the story of Stingy Jack, but my favorite one is the one I'm going to go into. So, Stingy Jack was this total stereotypical drunken Irishman. He makes his way in the world as a cobbler, and he's just known as being a very stingy, kind of not great guy to hang around. The dude's kind of a jerk. But one day there's this old peddler man, and he's kind of walking down the trail, and he falls down, and Stingy Jack, somewhat uncharacteristically, stops and helps him up and gets him on his way. So while he's helping this old man out, the man reveals himself to be an angel. Of the Christian faith, obviously. And the angel decides to grant him 3 wishes, and old Stingy Jack, he knows exactly what he wants. His first wish is that he wishes that no man ever sit in his chair, and if any man ever tries to sit in his chair, he would be rooted to the ground. The second wish is he had this favorite tree in his yard, and he said that anybody who takes wood from that tree would be forever condemned to be rooted to the ground as a tree, I guess. And for his third wish, the same punishment would be inflicted on anybody who ever tried to steal his cobbling tools. The angel, realizing that Jack is kind of a dick, grants him his wishes, but bars him from ever entering heaven, because he used these wishes for cruel and selfish means. So Jack, he's still living his life, and he kind of gets the reputation as being even more of a dick. He becomes kind of a deceiver and a manipulator, kind of like the local village con man. Everybody hates him, no one trusts him, he's just that guy. So, typical of Jack, he was out drinking at the pub one night, and he's stumbling home, and he comes across a body laying there on the path in the same spot where he encountered that old peddler man years ago. He goes up to the body, and the body gets up and reveals himself as the devil himself, Satan, Beelzebub, the serpent in the garden. We all know, the devil. The devil tells him, Jack, now I've heard of your evil deeds and your silver tongue. I heard what happened to that guy that sat in your chair that one time. Well, I'm here to tell you that your time has come, and I have decided to personally collect your malevolent soul. And upon hearing this, Jack seemed to accept his fate. He said, well, Satan, I am barred from heaven, so I guess I have no better place to go now but to hell, but before I go, may I make one last request? And the devil, seeing no reason to deny a man of his last request before he enters an eternity of, fire and poking, says, yeah, sure, I'll grant you a last request. What do you want? He says to the devil, well, this experience has scared me sober. May we go to the local pub and drink ale so I can spend the afterlife drunk? The devil says, no problem, let's go to the pub. So they go to the pub, they have a few pints, but to both their surprise, they find themselves without any money and unable to pay the tab. And the guy behind the bar, he's one of those big dudes, he probably has a bat, and he's not going to be too happy with these 2 patrons not paying for their ale. So Jack says to the devil, don't worry, I have a brilliant idea. Turn yourself into a silver coin. I'll put the coin in my pocket, I'll use it to pay the bartender, and then when he's not looking, you just jump out and turn back into the devil. And the devil being the devil, he's like, dude, that's brilliant, why didn't I think of that? So the devil turns into a silver coin, Jack takes a silver coin and he sticks it in his pocket. But what the devil didn't know was, in that pocket, Jack was carrying a crucifix. Jack then cleverly pulls another coin out of his other pocket, pays the bartender, and he's off. But now the devil's got a problem. He's stuck in Jack's pocket with this crucifix, and he can't turn back into the devil. He's stuck in this coin form. However, in this form, he can still talk to Jack, and he's like, hey, let me out of here. What are you doing? And Jack says, okay, listen, you got 2 choices. 1, I leave you in that pocket forever next to that crucifix, and when they eventually toss my body into a pauper's grave, you can spend eternity as a buried coin. Or you can spare my soul for another 10 years, and I will release you. The devil, seeing himself in a lose-lose situation, is just like, okay, Jack, I agree. I'll see you in 10 years. So Jack lives out the next 10 years of his life, and 10 years to the day, the devil returns in order to collect Jack's soul. He shows up, he says, okay, Jack, I gave you 10 more years. It's time. And to the devil's astonishment, Jack agrees. So they're walking down the path and they come across an apple tree. And the devil kind of just says aloud, "Those apples on that tree look as good as the ones in Eden." And Jack says to the devil, "Well, if they're that good, why don't you go up there and get me one? It's the least you can do considering where I'm going." So the devil, being the devil and I guess true to his moniker, he morphs into a snake and he climbs a tree and he grabs an apple. Now, while the devil is in this tree, Jack grabs a bunch of crucifixes that he carries with him at all times out of his pocket, and he created a ring of them around the base of this apple tree. And the devil is like, "Dude, are you fucking kidding me?" And Jack says, "You really are an idiot. I mean, I heard about you and that fiddle player in Georgia, but damn." And the devil's like, "Okay, what do you want? You want another 10 years? And Jack is like, "No, I want you to promise me that you will never drag my soul to hell. You'll never attempt it when I die." The devil says, "Dude, you are worse than me. I forever banish you from hell." Eventually, old stingy Jack, he lives out his life to a ripe old age, and the drink finally takes its toll. He dies of like cirrhosis of the liver or something. They toss his ass in a pauper's grave, and they don't even bother to mark it because this is the guy that like everybody in the village just hated at this point. So Jack's soul was sitting up there in that like stereotypical view of heaven, you know, the gated community, and St. Peter sitting there with a book. Jack walks up to St. Peter and says, "Yeah, it's me, Stingy Jack, let me in, I want to hit the bar." And St. Peter's like, "Don't you remember all those years ago when that angel barred you from heaven? No, you're not getting in." So Jack decides, "Okay, fine, I'll go to hell. I know the manager, he'll let me in." So Jack descends into the underworld. He's standing there at the gates of hell. Cerberus looks up at him and growls. There's like fire everywhere and demons floating around, and they're playing Iron Man by Black Sabbath. There's some angry old woman walking around beating Satan with a purse, telling him to turn up the heat because it's too cold in here. Jack gets up to the gates, and the devil's standing there with a smug grin on his face. And Jack's like, "Okay, I'm here, let me in." And the devil's like, "I can't let you in. I may be the devil, but I keep my promises and I don't break my contracts. And if you don't like that, I have every lawyer who's ever existed in here on my side." So Jack's sitting there and he's like, "Well, what do I do? They won't let me into heaven and you won't let me into hell." And the devil's like, "Well, I guess you're just doomed to roam the earth forever. Here's a pamphlet on how to be a ghost. But I'm not a totally unreasonable guy. I know you'll have to roam earth at night. I'll give you a lantern to light your way." The devil takes out a piece of brimstone, he sticks it in a turnip, hands it to Jack, and says, "Well, this is it. Have fun being a ghost." And it's said that Stingy Jack forever roams the countryside with his lantern, hence Jack-o'-lantern. Now that's a fun little story, which is a play on the words Jack-o'-lantern, but how that all comes into context during All Souls Day is the carving of root vegetables and sticking candles in them was this way that ancient people would ward off evil spirits, especially during Halloween time or Samhain time. Now, the modern practice of the jack-o'-lantern doesn't really become widespread until about the 19th century. And America really doesn't take off until we get that wave of kind of Irish immigration. And they realize that pumpkins are just better suited for the task. And because pumpkins are just better than turnips, period. To be perfectly honest, I've never met anybody in my life who was excited to be eating a turnip. But that kind of becomes our modern idea of the jack-o'-lantern. You stick it outside, it's decorative, it's spooky. And in modern times, the religious connection has gone away. We no longer use them to ward off evil spirits, now they're just a decorative thing. But it is a fun little tradition. So let's kind of recap where we are right now. We've talked a little bit about how it's associated with the dead, how it's become a Christian holiday, how souling is kind of the early precursor to modern trick-or-treating, and we've discussed kind of the origin of jack-o'-lanterns. But another big thing when it comes to Halloween is costuming, especially in the modern times. So where did that idea come from? Why do we dress up on Halloween as ghosts and spirits and monsters? And that idea has roots in early medieval times as well. And to be honest, the best interpretation comes from a Christian minister. He states that it's linked to this ancient belief of vengeful ghosts. As we recall from that discussion about Samhain, that is the night where the veil between our world and the spirit world is at its thinnest. And during that time, spirits walk the earth. And some of these spirits are vengeful. It's believed that this is the time where if a spirit wanted to, it could take its revenge on, let's say, a jilted lover or an enemy. And it's argued that by the donning of masks and costumes, it would disguise someone from being recognized by a vengeful spirit as they were celebrating this day, celebrating this harvest festival, or out souling. Now, as Christianity in the Middle Ages kind of takes over the whole thing, it's stated that on the night of All Hallows Eve, some churches in Europe, mostly churches that didn't have relics of saints or martyrs, poorer churches, they would allow their parishioners to dress up as certain saints during All-Hallowtide. And in some church congregations, this still goes on to this day. And that's a way of paying respect to these saints and martyrs. And in places like France, it just gets weird, especially post-bubonic plague. Now, I'm talking about that first one that came in like the 1340s or whatever. And for this, we need a little bit of context. So, 1346, the Black Death comes in. It wipes out nearly half of Europe. And it really leads to this era where, especially that first generation, is fascinated by death. They see death all around them. I mean, the Black Death was a horrible time. Cemeteries were overflowing with corpses. It got to the point where they just had to start burying people in mass graves. It kind of leads to the rise of the catacombs in Paris, which I'll get into in a future episode because it's a very fascinating topic. But all this constant death led to an art style known as Danse Macabre, or here in American, Dance of Death. It's an art style. And without getting too far out in the weeds, it's basically created to remind people of the frailty of life and how vain the glories of earth are. And a lot of depictions in this art are literally skeletons dancing and partying in cemeteries with death. And part of this movement takes that idea of this time of year being the time when the dead come back to a logical extreme where they depict this imagery of the dead literally rising from their graves as skeletons and corpses and throwing a dark carnival in a cemetery. And this becomes emulated at masks and balls during this time of year where they start dressing as the dead. They dress as skeletons and corpses. And some people believe that this may be the origin of the modern Halloween party, or it's at least starting to cycle back from that Christian feast to this more ancient pre-Christian harvest festival-like atmosphere. Now, I could really deep dive into Danse Macabre and all that fun stuff, but I don't want to here. But I would encourage anybody to go read about it because it is a fascinating movement in art history. However, once we get to the point of the Reformation, there is a cultural backlash. The Protestants come in and they start kind of quashing everything. And then in places like England, although it's still going on, it falls out of the mainstream. It becomes overshadowed by Guy Fawkes Day. And then when the Puritans take over, they pretty much try to wipe it out because the Puritans didn't like anything fun. The Puritans' idea of fun was literally sitting in a church getting screamed at about going to hell and being a witch. And if you deemed that to be fun, then you were still banished to go to hell according to them. So when the Puritans come around, they really put a damper on everything for a while. However, in heavily Catholicized areas, the traditions kind of endure, especially in Ireland. Kind of ironic that the Catholic Church preserves something that has pagan origins, but as the old saying goes, even a broken clock is right twice a day. And to be honest, as we move into the early modern period and the Age of Enlightenment and the First Industrial Revolution, it really cycles back to being an extremely localized thing associated with Irish and Celtic peoples and 19th century Americans. And in America is where it really kicks off and has that big, great revival. And it's mostly thanks to Irish and Scottish and even like German immigration, because they would obviously bring their traditional games and practices and celebrations to the New World. Now, a lot of these traditions had kind of been honed in their home countries, such as some of the games that you play around Halloween time. For example, things like bobbing for apples or or the carving of jack-o'-lanterns, or that game where you put egg whites into water and it's supposed to spell out who you're gonna marry. A lot of divination-esque like games are played during Halloween. And the idea of pranking really comes out of these Irish and Scottish cultures. And it's said to be the Scots who invent the idea of the mischief or the pranks. So for context, by this time, there were many different traditions being played out where children, mostly, were going house to house begging for food on this night or sweets. And in some of these traditions, welcoming the children into your home, giving them sweets or whatever, would bring good fortune upon you. In Scotland, it got a little off the rails because you had these youths going from house to house, and the idea was you're going to welcome me in or mischief will ensue. And this kind of leads to the early origins of Mischief Night or Prank Night. And, you know, kids being kids, boys being boys, we're obviously going to take Mischief Night to the extreme, especially here in America when it kicks off. So here in America, we've had Irish immigration since the very beginning. I mean, hell, even my family came here in the 1640s from County Longford, Ireland, so you could say there's a long history of Irish immigration to the Americas. But it really doesn't start to ramp up till about the middle of the 19th century. Roughly 1840s, it really gets high in the 1860s. That's kind of why there's more people of Irish descent here in America than just about anywhere else in the world. But it's really not until then, probably post-Civil War I'd say, when Halloween really starts to become a thing here in America. There might be some references to it on an extremely local scale going back to when the Puritans first arrived, but it really doesn't become an American tradition until post-Civil War. And it's at this point when all of these traditions converge into the modern idea of Halloween. And at first it's mostly in these local immigrant communities, but in the 1910s, 1920s, that's when it becomes commercialized. So by the 1910s, we're already seeing Halloween postcards. There's already books out about Halloween in America, how to celebrate it, what games to play, etc., etc. And you start seeing the earliest incarnation of American trick-or-treat, and it's happening on a very local scale. It's town to town. It's not a national holiday yet. But it does start growing in popularity, and one of the reasons it starts growing in popularity is because of an adjacent unofficial holiday which happens on Halloween, known as Mischief Night. Now, Mischief Night is kind of rooted in that idea that came from Scotland with the pranking, and it's kind of rooted in trick-or-treat. And in the rough and tumble early days of Mischief Night, it was absolutely insane. And these aren't like the harmless pranks that you see today where you go out and toilet paper someone's house or you soap their windows. And I don't know, maybe you hold the neighbor's cat for ransom while he goes and gets the full-size Snicker bars and not those dumb little fun-size ones. On a side note, stop calling them fun-size, they're bite-sized. There's nothing fun about one bite of a candy bar. You want to create a fun size? Make a candy bar that's like the size of a brick of gold bullion or something. I would call that fun size. But nah, these pranks and stuff that were happening on Mischief Night back in the wild days of the 10s and the 20s, these just didn't borderline on vandalism and criminal damaging. These were like felonies. These kids would go out and they would run wild through these neighborhoods. They would be like kicking down people's fences and throwing rocks through windows. They were tipping over outhouses and disassembling cars. There was literal waves of destruction going on in these towns. Hell, in the 30s in Detroit, there were like literal accounts of arson. And it got to the point where it was getting so bad that they were going to ban Halloween in a lot of these towns because of this destructive nature. However, by the 1930s, Halloween had spread so far across America that it kind of became an entrenched American tradition. So while some local municipalities started to ban it, others started looking into ways to change it, to tone it down. And that all started to change right around the end of World War II. And this was the era of McCarthyism and conformism, when that classic American values kind of movement really took off. And that's when the marketing around Halloween took this new direction. Wanted to create a safe, fun, commercialized holiday for kids that would rake in a lot of money through candy sales and costume sales. And to be honest, it was really the rise of television in the late 40s, early 50s that really paved the path forward for Halloween. And that really pushed forth the narrative that this was a safe, fun holiday for kids to go out and get free candy and dress up like witches and stuff. And in America, for a long time, that was the general idea. It's a safe, fun holiday for kids to go out and collect candy. And for the most part, the adults would be the ones stuck at home handing out the candy. And some of them would get on the fun. They might have a little Halloween party or whatever. But all in all, it had become stereotypically Americanized. It's commercial, it's safe, it's fun. It's quintessential suburban America. Everything else had kind of been stripped from it. Now things like jack-o'-lanterns and the imagery of the Danse Macabre and the tradition of harvest festivals and stuff, it was all aesthetic, it was decorative, it was just supposed to be fun. There's no more depth or meaning or religious connotations to it. At least until the 1970s, when there was this new evangelical wave of Christian revivalism going on in the United States. This was a conservative cultural backlash against the hippieism of the 60s. Some people call it the Fourth Great Awakening, some people call it the Jesus Movement, but it really kicks off evangelical America as we know it today. And this cultural backlash really went and still goes hard against Halloween to this day. And to be perfectly blunt, this backlash was mostly led by uninformed suburban white ladies who are just miserable in life and feel the need to ruin everything that is even perceived as fun in the world. Think of like a hyper-Christianized version of a Karen. Those are the types of characters that lead this cultural backlash against Halloween in the 70s and 80s. These were very ill-informed people who self-appointed themselves as experts, and they really pushed forth the satanic panic that went through the 80s into the 90s and kind of resurged in the last few years. And if you want to hear more about the satanic panic, I did talk about it heavily in my season 3 finale on Satan. I've never specifically dedicated an episode to it, but I do heavily revisit it from time to time. Maybe one day I'll do an episode where I just talk about the satanic panic, because I'm surprised I haven't done that yet. But this kicks off in the 70s, where you get these evangelical, mostly suburban white women who in a roundabout way start reconnecting the images and the traditions of Halloween with the religious aspects of it. Particularly the pre-Christian religious aspects of it, which they instantly equate to Satanism. So they start going on this crusade against everything Halloween, just like they went on a crusade against Dungeons and Dragons and video games and rock music and basically anything you would associate with, I guess, the darker aspects of life. You know, goth kids and vampires and horror films and stuff like that. And these crazy bitches who went on these crusades and still go on these crusades today had no problem just completely making up random bullshit, whatever lie they needed to tell to suit their needs. Now all of a sudden, if you participate in Halloween, you're a Satanist and you're going to hell. And only Satanists hand out candy on Halloween, and that candy is going to be poisoned. Which that in itself is another urban legend, which is taken from some real life stuff, but totally out of context. I'll explain. So the earliest rumors of poisoned or tampered with candy come from post-industrial revolution in England, as food production was more centralized. And it comes from the fact that there was no regulation on food back then. I mean, have you read The Jungle? I mean, it's absolutely horrific what they found in those meatpacking warehouses in the early 20th century, but I digress. So back then there was that idea that was circulating around, well, don't eat unfamiliar food because you don't know what's in it. And that kind of kicks off some of the earliest Halloween myths about, okay, that candy's probably not good for you. But it's in the 60s and 70s where we start really seeing some cases that give rise to the candy tampering myth. So, the earliest case of this comes from 1959 when a dentist in California gave candy-coated laxative pills to trick-or-treaters as a prank, and he was literally charged with outrage of public decency and unlawful dispensing of drugs. So obviously that guy's a dick. But it doesn't mean there's a cabal of Satanists out there poisoning candy. That's just a one-off. But then we don't see anything till 1964 when we go to Long Island. There was this woman who thought that the teenagers who were out trick-or-treating were a little too old to be trick-or-treating. So instead of giving them candy like she was giving the rest of the kids, she was giving these kids inedible objects like rocks and steel wool and dog biscuits. She even handed a kid one of those ant poison discs, and this was her way of saying, you're too old to be trick-or-treating, here, take this rock or ant poison disc or whatever and just get the hell out of here. Now, while no one was injured by that, she was prosecuted and pled guilty to endangering children by handing out these ant buttons to the kids. Of course, these children clearly knew what she was handing them. There was no trickery involved. They weren't stupid enough to try to eat ant poison or steal wool. But that further leads to the rise of the myth of poisoned or tampered with candy. And there's other little rumors that show up in Philadelphia and Detroit that year of some of the same stuff going on, but those weren't even substantiated, they were just rumors. But then in 1974, a very tragic event happens. So a man named Ronald Clark O'Brien, an optician from Texas, took his kids out trick-or-treating. So after visiting a home where the occupant failed to answer the door, the kids grew impatient and ran ahead to the next house. O'Brien purposely stays behind on the front porch as the rest of his group kind of moves on. Eventually he catches up to the group and he produced 5 21-inch pixie sticks, and these were the big old school pixie sticks, so they were freaking awesome. And he claimed that he was giving them to the occupant of the house who had not answered the door initially. Of course, this was a lie. At the end of the evening, when his trick-or-treating was done, he gave pixie sticks to his neighbor's 2 children, one to his son Timothy, one to his daughter Elizabeth, and another to a 10-year-old boy whom he recognized from his church. He does this deliberately and on purpose to make it look random. So that night before he went to bed, Timothy asked his father if he could eat some of that candy he collected. His father said yes, and Timothy chose to eat the pixie stick. So O'Brien, he opens up the pixie stick, he loosens up the powder for him, and little Timothy complains, "This tastes kind of bitter, I don't like it." So O'Brien gives his son some Kool-Aid in order to wash the taste out of his mouth. However, immediately after this, he started to complain that his stomach was hurting and he started vomiting and convulsing. O'Brien claims that he held Timothy in his arms while he was convulsing and vomiting in the bathroom until he went limp, and the child tragically died on his way to the hospital. That pixie stick contained potassium cyanide that was put there by his father. Now, this being a small community, as soon as the people of this community heard that a kid had just died from eating tainted Halloween candy, they panicked. Parents flocked to the police station with their bags of candy, fearing that it was laced with poison. However, luckily, the other 4 children did not consume the tainted pixie sticks, which were all found to be contained with potassium cyanide. Now, initially, the police didn't suspect O'Brien, but O'Brien's story quickly fell apart. He claimed he couldn't remember which house he got the pixie sticks from, and that it couldn't be him. He was a victim in all of this. But the police knew that they had their man when they found out that he was over $100,000, the equivalent of $620,000 today, in debt, and that he had life insurance policies on his kids, which in the case of poor Timothy would have paid out about $10,000. That asshole was sentenced to death, and that was a media sensation, and it gave more rise to that idea of tainted candy. Watch out for your Halloween candy. There's poison candy out there. However, it really becomes a case of a guy intentionally killing his own child for life insurance money. But when the evangelical Halloween haters latch onto it and spin it through their propaganda, now we have a war on Halloween. And it's a Christian crusade in order to keep our children safe and in the hands of Jesus or whatever. But then the media gets a hold of it, and anything the media gets a hold of in America becomes instantly over-sensationalized because journalists here in America have absolutely no integrity whatsoever. They're basically whores to ratings. So they latch onto this and they push forth and go full force into this war on Halloween, satanic panic. There are people out there who are going to give your kids crack and they're going to convince them to worship Satan and play Dungeons and Dragons, and it just all cycles back. But luckily that backlash doesn't kill Halloween altogether. In fact, it makes it more popular than ever. And with these evangelicals knowing that they can't fight it or destroy it, they decide to basically join in on it with their own weird Christian spin. And that's where you start to see these Christian alternatives to Halloween pop up. So on Halloween night, instead of going out trick-or-treating, you go to a church parking lot and you're handed candy out of the trunk of somebody's car for whatever reason. I don't know why they created that. Yes, thank you for your trunk candy. It only slightly smells like gasoline, and oh look, I got the piece that was sitting next to the spare tire. But then it gets crazier, like they have this stuff in the churches that are very religious and anti-Halloween. And they basically do things like anti-haunted houses, which shows you the dangers of Satan worship and the dangers of Halloween and the pagan roots of Halloween and all this scary stuff. Because in the Christian mind, if it's not Jesus, it's automatically Satan. Anything that's not affiliated with the church is automatically Satan. And while you think that would be awesome, it's so milquetoast and white suburbanite that it's almost embarrassing if you're a part of it. But, you know, Jesus loves you and all that garbage. But those people are really their own worst enemy because, as I said, Halloween in America is more popular than ever before because it's become more accepted than ever before. Especially as we finally start to move beyond a Christian society. Because nowadays, Halloween is freaking awesome. You could literally celebrate it every day of the year if you want, if you're into that lifestyle. I mean, it's kind of what we try to do here with this show. And when you throw good old-fashioned Hollywood into the mix, it just makes it 100 times more awesome. I mean, Halloween is one of the greatest horror movie franchises of all time. Especially when you realize the fact that the mask of Michael Myers is literally a William Shatner mask. And that's not an urban legend, that is a true story. The story basically goes that they were trying to create a mask for this character, and they were in this shop, like a costume shop, and they found this really crappy, terribly made mask of William Shatner and was like, that one. And now it's been a franchise that's more part of Halloween than almost any other franchise. It's over 40 years old. And the best part is the adults have really gotten back into it, especially my generation, us millennials. We truly do look forward to our Halloween parties, and we go all out these days with the costuming and the decorations. You can literally buy costumes now that are such high quality they'll last for years. For example, I have a werewolf costume. It's like just the mask and the hands. I paid like $70 for that, and it's going on 3 years now, and I'll most likely wear it again this year because werewolves are freaking awesome. Of course, this year I'm thinking of combining it with some of these like 1970s disco clothes I found. So I might be like a disco werewolf, which will be even more awesome. But one of the coolest parts about the holiday is there has been a real true revival in the history of it, especially the pre-Christian history, which just fascinates me just given my background in anthropology, archaeology, etc. And there are a ton of like neo-pagan groups out there now and like modern, I guess, Celtic groups. I don't really know what they call themselves, who have rekindled those old traditions and they want to preserve them so future generations can truly understand what it is. They can truly understand the context of the whole thing. And I think that's awesome, and especially in this era where you can truly have both. You can celebrate it in the modern, commercialized, give me candy, I want to wear a costume, and not really worry about the whole religious thing. Or you can celebrate it in that old Celtic tradition of a harvest festival, a bonfire, sacrifices, and honoring the spirits of those who came before you. Or if you're on the Christian side of things, you can do it your way. If you like the bland, safe, milquetoast suburbanite, I'm holier than thou and everybody's going to hell lifestyle, then to be honest, who am I to tell you can't do it? At the end of the day, it's your life. You're free to do whatever you want. Who am I to tell you what to do or what you can't do? But just know that you do represent everything I believe is wrong with this nation and this world. So have fun with that. Good old personal biases seeping in. I try to keep it neutral here, but hey, it happens. I get passionate about stuff. But yeah, Halloween. It's probably my personal favorite holiday, other than the 4th of July, mostly just because of how fascinating it is. And to be honest, this was just a general overview. I could deep dive into other subjects, but as always, if I did that, this episode would be 3 hours long. And for scheduling reasons, I really try to keep these episodes under an hour. But it is a fascinating holiday, and I encourage anyone to look into the history of it, because this led me down a series of rabbit holes that I didn't even think I was going to dive down. To be honest, this episode started out as just a little bonus episode where I was just going to tell the story of Stingy Jack. But this is what it devolved into, so this is what you get. On that note, I am going to end it here. As always, this is Mike. You have been listening to the Urban Legends and Mythology podcast. As always, if you like it, give it those 5 stars on Spotify. Follow it on Spotify. That's extremely important. You can also support the show by donating via that link in the description of every episode. You people that do that are the true rock stars that keep this show going. And if you don't want to do any of that, just tell a friend you're listening to a fun podcast. The primary way this show grows is through word of mouth. That's how I've made it into 59 countries at the time of recording. And that's all due to you guys. So once again, I truly do thank you guys. Happy Halloween, and I will see you in the next one.